Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video we are going to talk about the Szarekhan Dynasty. Though it is a relatively new Necron dynasty on the tabletop, the dynasty itself has had a long history that spans back as far back as the Second Wars of Succession. Without further delay, let's get into it. There are several things that are unique about the Szarekhan dynasty, right? So their heraldic color of the Szarekhan dynasty is bronze, which is something that is kind of unique amongst the Necrons because usually we see Necrons in silver necrodermis, but the Szarekhan dynasty has bronze armor, bronze necrodermis. The Szarekhan dynasty, unlike almost all other dynasties, has multiple dynastic territories throughout the Milky Way galaxy, primarily to the south, southeast, and north of the Segmentum Solar. The pharon of the Szarekhan dynasty is Szarekh, who is also the Silent King of the Necron Empire, but their pharon is also a Necron called Azmathep, and Haptatra, and Misafet, and likely quite a few other Necrons. This is because the Szarekhan dynasty has multiple pharons, and you'll need to understand the history and traditions of the dynasty to understand why. According to available information, the Szarekhan dynasty was a prominent house during the War in Heaven, with Szarekh himself being the last of the dynasty's pharon before the Necrontyr went into the process of biotransference. Before Szarekh, though, the Szarekhan dynasty had generations of its members serving as the Silent King of the Necrontyr peoples. This is a curious bit of information because, as we have discussed in the introductory Necron deep dives, we know that Szarekh himself was not the Silent King during the expansion or even during the First Wars of Succession, but he was Silent King after the First Wars with the Old Ones. This places both the reign of Szarekh and the rise of the Szarekhan dynasty distinctly within the period of the Second Wars of Succession, after the First Wars against the Old Ones, in which the Necrontyr were beaten back to their homeworld for about 1,000 years. As we have said in previous videos, during the Wars of Succession, Necron dynasties were created and destroyed, with some dynasties even splitting. So the fact that the Szarekhan dynasty has its origins during this time of conflict makes a lot of sense, but we must also consider that if the Necrontyr were stuck on their homeworld for around 1,000 years after being beaten back to it by the Old Ones, and the Szarekhan dynasty had generations of figures serve as the Silent King of the Necrontyr, then that must sound more grandiose than what it actually was, considering the short lives of the Necrontyr due to the cancers and sicknesses that they had, but also due to their reign coinciding with the time of war and conflict amongst the Necrontyr people. In this context, the Szarekhan dynasty ruling for generations could mean the full 1,000 years that the Necrontyr were stuck on their homeworld, or it could only mean a few hundred years, and if it was the latter, then the last few hundred years before biotransference. An interesting bit of lore is that none of the Necrontyrs in the current setting can remember far back enough into their past to discern the exact history of the Szarekhan dynasty. In some places, this is attributed to the Silent King having wiped the Necron memory of the process of biotransference to prevent them from turning against him. But there might be another reason for this, and to understand this reason, we have to look into the tradition of the Triarch and the position of the Silent King. So the Triarch was the ruling council of the Necrontyr people. It was composed of 3 pharons, which were the leaders of their own dynasties. One of the pharons served on the Triarch as the Silent King, the name and role given to the ultimate ruler of the Necrontyr Empire. Whichever pharon served as the Silent King had their dynasty bolstered because the dynasties of the other 2 pharons on the Triarch became the Silent King's dynasty. What their dynasty was before didn't truly matter anymore because their dynasties became the dynasty of whatever dynasty that the Silent King led. In this case, the other 2 pharons of the Triarch had their dynasties become part of the Szarekhan dynasty, and they themselves became pharons of the Szarekhan dynasty. At least initially, because we don't exactly know when the Szarekhan dynasty rose to power or for how long, but we do know that there were quite a few generations of pharaohs from the Szarekhan dynasty. Now, there's no way for us to tell if any of the previous silent kings that were of the Szarekhan dynasty were originally of the Szarekhan dynasty, or if they were members of the dynasty that inherited the position through Triarch tradition. Perhaps the Silent King erased the Necron memory to that extent so that they would not remember the dynasties that served as part of the Triarch and became Szarekhan. But there's another aspect to this. Szarekh and the dynasty he is a part of, and Pharaon too, have the same name. Now, a question that I have, being that this is the case with Szarekh, is if all dynasties were named after one of their pharaohs. Another question that comes to mind is if the dynasties are named after their first pharaohs. If this is the case, then there's a possibility that Szarekh was the first pharaoh of his dynasty. With the reign of the Szarekhan dynasty happening during a time of conflict, how did the Szarekhan dynasty rise to power and influence in such a brief period of time? Perhaps it is that the Silent King does not want the Necrons to remember. The mysterious origins of the Szarekhan dynasty, its relatively quick rise to power, and its natural acquisition of other dynasties through that power are all things that continue to affect the current narrative of the Necrons. If we look at the 9th edition Codex map for the Necrons and compare it with the 8th edition Codex map of the Necrons, not only do we see that the Szarekhan dynastic territories are now widespread throughout the Milky Way galaxy, but if we have an inquisitive eye, at least half of them are in areas where there was once another Necron dynastic territory. On the 8th edition Necron Codex map, where the Caradon sector is marked, there are 4 dynastic territories, the Nihilakh, then moving toward the east, the Urusk, and moving north from the Urusk, the Hyrek dynasty territory, and moving east from the Hyrek is the Sakimtar dynastic territory, forming a kind of diamond of dynastic territories. However, in the 9th edition Codex map, the Hyrek dynasty territory is missing. According to the lore for the Hyrek dynasty, the Eldar knew exactly when the dynasty would awaken, and so when it did, the Eldar were there and they annihilated the dynasty. Though, it is said that there is a Hyrek tomb world still existing somewhere in that area, and that it somehow avoided destruction. If we look in the 9th edition Codex map, around where the Hyrek dynasty used to be, there now exists a Szarekhan dynastic territory. The Agdagoth dynastic territory that was on the 8th edition map is missing on the 9th edition map. According to the lore for the Agdagoth, they abandoned their tomb world when it succumbed to the Flayer virus. Where there once was an Agdagoth dynastic territory on the 8th edition map, there exists a Szarekhan dynasty territory. Is it possible that the Szarekhan dynasty claimed both the dynastic territories and dynasties of the Hyrek and Agdagoth? I think it is definitely possible. However, to be fair, there are also Szarekhan dynasty territories where there were no dynastic territories before, such as the area of space in between the Tronovac dynasty and the Saltek dynasty territories, and the area of space near the Novak dynasty territory. If one thing can be said about the Szarekhan dynasty, it is that they are aggressively expansionist, having claimed wide areas of territory all across the Milky Way galaxy in the short amount of time that it has been since they have awakened. At the same time, though, all of that dynastic territory might not have been originally theirs. But back to the leadership of the Szarekhan dynasty, which may give context to a lot of this. As I said earlier in the video, the Szarekhan dynasty has multiple pharaohs, and this is because of the dynasty's acquisition of other dynasties through the achievement of its pharaohs serving on the Triarch. The most prominent pharaoh of the Szarekhan dynasty is Szarekh. Szarekh became the Silent King of the Necrontyr Empire after the First War with the Old Ones, and it was during his reign that the Necrontyr underwent biotransference, contacted the Satan, and fought against the forces of the Old One in a millennia-spanning conflict known as the War in Heaven. Szarekh was the last of the Silent Kings, and after the Necrontyr became Necrons, he had complete control of his people, forbidding the infighting that riddled their past, and unifying them against the Old Ones in a way that could not have been achieved before by using powerful command protocols. After the Necrons won the war in heaven, he wielded the Necrons against the Star Gods themselves, enslaving them to the will of the Necron Empire, breaking them into shards to be used as batteries and weapons of destruction. After enslaving the Satan, it was the Silent King who commanded the Necron dynasties into the Great Sleep, in which all the Necrons entombed themselves in stasis crypts for about 60 million years. However, Szarekh himself did not enter the Great Sleep. Instead, he did two things. He broke the command protocols that he had over the Necrons, relinquishing his control over them. And the second thing that he did was take some of his dynasty with him on an intergalactic voyage into the outer dark on what is frequently referred to as a trip of penance. This penance was needed because, according to the lore, Szarekh grew to hate the decision that he had made to turn his people and himself into Necrons, and that hate and regret poisoned his ability to truly enjoy the degree of control that he had over his people. There are even rumors that Szarekh sought to somehow reverse biotransference and turn his people back into flesh and blood beings. Now, in regards to relinquishing the command protocols over the Necron dynasties, I'm curious as to how such a thing could be possible, and I question his motives for doing so. In regards to how it was possible, I can only speculate that removing the command protocols had an effect on the memory of the Necrons to some degree. In regards to the motives for doing so, I am skeptical. I do not believe that a character such as Szarekh does things primarily out of remorse or regret for previous decisions that he has made. He rose too quickly into power during a time of civil conflict to be much of a remorseful individual, first and foremost. And while I do think that he regret his decision, I don't think that that was a primary reason as to why he relinquished his protocols. After the Necrontyr expanded from their homeworld, the first Wars of Secession happened, during which the Necrontyr very nearly wiped each other out. After they were beaten back to their homeworld and kept there for around 1,000 years by the Old Ones, the second Wars of Secession happened. The Necrontyr are a people characterized by their infighting when things don't go their way. If not for the command protocols during the War in Heaven, the Necron dynasties would have likely started to fight each other again for one reason or another after defeating the Old Ones. This could have been another reason why Szarekh wielded the Necron Empire against the Satan themselves, keeping them united through fighting a common enemy. If this is the case, then why would he remove the command protocols after enacting the Great Sleep? I suggest the possibility that Szarekh removed the protocols because when the legions woke after the Great Sleep, he actually wanted them to fight each other. Perhaps what remorse he did have was manifested in this way: have the Necron dynasties destroy each other. Perhaps from the ashes of that destruction, the possibility of something new could arise, and whatever was left, he could lead. Szarekh, in his voyage into the Outer Dark, encountered the Tyranid Xeno species and determined them to be the biggest threat to the galaxy and to his plans to reverse biotransference. With that knowledge acquired over 60 million years of travel, he returned to the Milky Way galaxy just as the dynasties began to awake, measuring the state of things in the Necron Empire before revealing himself as having returned as the Silent King. However, his return was met with mixed reaction. Some welcomed him back as their Silent King, while others blamed him for their current state of being, and blamed him for any of the tragedies that their Necron dynasties have experienced during the Great Sleep. While those dynasties that blamed him stood against him, those of his dynasty stood with him and others swore loyalty to him. It is here that we discover three other pharons of the Szarekhan dynasty. The first is a figure known as Azmathep, who was apparently a pharaoh of the Szarekhan dynasty before the Great Sleep. When the Silent King chose to exile himself rather than join in the Great Sleep, many thought it was because the Silent King was choosing to abandon his people, but Azmathep believed that the Silent King was doing so for a greater purpose beyond the understanding of the Necron people. When the Silent King returned, Azmathep sided with him. During the enslavement of the star gods, the other two pharaohs of the Triarch were destroyed along with millions of Necrons. After their destruction, no other Necron took up the positions on the Triarch. I mention this again for two reasons. The first reason is to give Azmathep credit where it is due. Though I am not certain as to whether Azmathep was an original Szarekhan noble or if he inherited the position through tradition, he is the only other Szarekhan pharaoh besides Szarekh from the time of the War in Heaven to be mentioned in the current lore. Being that the Szarekhan dynasty awoke before the Silent King's return, and taking into consideration that Szarekh has mostly been tending to his own goals, I think that it's fair to say that a large percentage of the rapid expansion of the Szarekhan dynasty territory can be attributed to the efforts and leadership of Azmathep. The second reason I mentioned the old Triarch is because the other two Szarekhan dynasty pharaohs are the two pharaohs that stand at the side of the Silent King as part of the new Triarch. Their names are Habdatra the Radiant and Misafet of the Shadowed Hand, and they are amongst the newest members of the Szarekhan dynasty. When Szarekh revealed himself as the Silent King returned, both Habdatra and Misafet came before him to swear loyalty to him. They were both pharaohs of their own dynasties, and according to the lore, their dynasties were of a quote-unquote lesser status. Due to their loyalty and service to the Silent King, Szarekh made both of them pharaohs of the new Triarch. Their dynasties became subsumed into the Szarekhan dynasty, and they themselves became Szarekhan pharaohs, or pharaohs of the Szarekhan dynasty. Habdatra the Radiant was given the Staff of Stars and was titled the Pharaoh of the Stars, and Misafet was given the Scythe of Dust and was titled the Pharaoh of the Blades. Now, though it does not truly matter because they and their dynasties are Szarekhan now, I cannot help but wonder from which dynasties these two pharaohs originally hailed. Luckily for us, GW has given us clues by presenting what could be assumed to be the pharaoh's dynastic ankhs in front of them on the DS of Dominion. But unfortunately for us, they are dead ends. These ankhs are not shown in any available record. There are many Necron dynasties whose ankhs are not shown in any available record as well, so their dynasty could be any of those dynasties, especially considering that many of those dynasties could be considered of a lesser status. But I just can't believe that the Silent King would allow these pharaohs to become members of the Triarch unless they had something he wanted control over. Their dynasties became his after all, and so did their territories. Now, if I were to speculate, I would say that Habdatra the Radiant comes from the Atun dynasty, and Misafet comes from the Maynarkh dynasty, and here's why. First, concerning the ankhs presented on the DS of Dominion, neither of them are Szarekhan dynasty ankhs, so to assume that they represent Triarch ankhs is not unreasonable. But maybe the reason why their ankhs are not listed or shown in any other place is because they represent an updated version of the original dynastic ankhs of whatever dynasty they belonged to. Dynastic ankhs can change over time to tell the history of a dynasty. We saw this in our first video with the Charnovac dynasty. Their ankh at one point in time looked differently to some degree. Perhaps then, the ankhs of the DS of Dominion represent the dynasty becoming Szarekhan and thus changed in some way. If this is the case, then looking for ankhs that look slightly similar may not be unreasonable either. Lastly, using clues to speculate to which dynasty they come from based on information given to us can help in the process of figuring out where they come from. The Ankh in front of Hapdatra the Radiant looks vaguely similar to the Ankh of the Atun dynasty. The Atun dynasty is a powerful Necron dynasty that exists in the northern fringes of the Milky Way galaxy and possesses a sizable territory in that area of space. That sizable territory that was once on the 8th edition Necron map is completely missing from the 9th edition Necron territory map. But there is a Szarekhan dynasty territory not too far away though. Now, why would the Silent King want to acquire the Atun dynasty and let one of its pharons join the Triarch? It could be because the Atun dynasty has been amassing many Necron treasures, including obelisks, which are powerful weapons used by the Necrons, and Tesseract vaults, which are also powerful weapons that are essentially trapped and weaponized star gods. With resources such as these at the Silent King's disposal, this could give him a massive boost in overall power. I mean, if you look at the Dais of Dominion, it is practically a Tesseract vault shaped as a throne with an enslaved Satan and bars of Noctilith for its protection. It is unknown if the title of Pharon of the Stars is a traditional Triarch title or a new one made by Szarekh. I would assume that, like his title itself, it is a traditional one, and in the case of Hapdatra, he was chosen to be the Pharon of the Stars because his dynasty possesses many weaponized shards of the star gods. If we look at the model for Hapdatra, he has a distinguishable one eye that is common with cryptex, and even his weapon of office, the Staff of Stars, could be mistaken as a cryptex rod. This makes me question if Hapdatra is truly a pharon or a cryptek in his previous dynasty, or if cryptex can even become pharons, as Hapdatra himself looks like a plasmancer. But that too is up for speculation. Perhaps the title has only to do with the weapon he is given as a mark of status and office, but the possible connection between being the Pharon of the Stars and coming from a dynasty with amassed shards of the star gods is, at the very least, an interesting theory. In regards to Misafet, the Pharon of the Blades who was given the Scythe of Dust, when looking at his Ankh, I honestly can't find any that looks even close to it. So instead, I choose to focus on the title given to him, the Pharon of the Blades, and to his own name, Misafet of the Shadowed Hand. I try to figure out what the blades were that the title is referring to. At first I thought of Lichguard, but then discarded that because there could not be a dynasty composed wholly of Lichguard. The second thing that came to mind were the Flayer blades. Following this line of thinking is what led me to reading about the Maynarkh dynasty. Anyone who knows anything about the Maynarkh dynasty knows that they deserve their own video, but unfortunately they're just going to be a feature in this video, but for good reason. The Maynarkh dynasty is one of the oldest Necron-tier dynasties and one of the most loyal to the Silent King and the Triarch. I emphasize that they were loyal to the throne, not to any Silent King in particular, which implies that they stood for the Necron Empire and most likely fought against the secessionists during the First and Second Wars of Secession as Necron-tier. They were already a powerful and menacing force as the Necron-tier, and during the reign of Szarekh, after biotransference, they were a terror to behold towards the enemies of Necrons and other Necrons as well. During the enslavement of the Satan, it was the Maynarkh dynasty that completely destroyed the Satan known as the Flayer, and as such, the Maynarkh dynasty were the first dynasty to experience the Flayer virus and thus develop the Flayer blades, which loops back to the whole Pharon of the Blades. Despite this, the Silent King Szarekh continued to show the dynasty favor, so much so that the royal courts of other dynasties, namely the Atun and the Saltek, tried to intervene with the dynasty's stasis crypts before the Great Sleep. These attempts were unsuccessful. The Silent King went to great lengths to protect the tomb worlds of the Maynarkh. The Maynarkh had even created new forms of canoptic constructs in order to protect their worlds, but the Silent King himself went the extra lengths to add extra levels of protection, and he even sent Triarch Praetorians to guard over the Maynarkh tomb worlds. He did everything he could to assure that they would survive the Great Sleep and be able to answer his call should he need them. Now, of course, when the dynasty awoke, many of them had succumbed to the Flayer virus, but many higher-ranking Necrons of the dynasty somehow resisted the virus. Some say that their inherent barbarism complemented the virus to the point where it made stronger-willed Necrons of the dynasty immune to it. It was the Maynarkh dynasty who completely annihilated the Orpheus sector in the Segmentum Tempestus. These guys aren't playing any games. Along with the Sautech, the Maynarkh dynasty is one of the most militarily minded Necron dynasties of all the dynasties, and they themselves have subjugated other Necron dynasties to their rule. An example of such is said to be the Verlect dynasty. However, it's not certain as to if they are a subjugated dynasty of the Maynarkh or if they are an offshoot of the Maynarkh. Regardless, the Maynarkh have subjugated many other Necron dynasties. Now, there are a few interesting things about the Maynarkh dynasty that make them kind of interesting and unique as well. Their tomb worlds exist outside the boundary of the Imperium, on the other side of the Segmentum Tempestus. They were there because the Maynarkh were exiled during the War in Heaven after succumbing to the Flayer virus, but this has benefited them and helped them to survive the Great Sleep by avoiding many of the phenomena that destroyed other dynastic territories. Their necrodermis color is silver and brass, and they lack the gold that is common with other Necron dynasties. Their inner energy is a deep orange instead of green, which gives them a sinister appearance. And another interesting fact about them is the Maynarkh dynasty is one of the few Necron dynasties ruled by a pharact, which is a matriarch instead of a patriarch. Her name is Zunbakir, and she is known as the Mother of Oblivion. Many times in the lore for the Maynarkh dynasty, the Maynarkh are considered and called the right hand of the Silent King because they served him in loyalty for so many years. Misophet could be of the Maynarkh dynasty, his name being the Shadowed Hand because the Maynarkh served as the right hand of the Silent King, which subjugated those who went against him. He could be given the title Pharon of the Blades because his dynasty is technically the first dynasty to experience the Flayer virus and develop Flayer blades. However, Haptacha being of the Atun dynasty and Misophet being of the Maynarkh are only my speculations, which could be easily disproven by the fact that both dynasties already have Pharons. Atun is the Pharon of the Atun dynasty, and Zunbakir is the pharact of the Maynarkh dynasty. As the lore says, the two characters were pharaons of lesser dynasties, and the Atun and the Maynarkh are definitely not lesser dynasties. So we might never know where these two pharaons actually come from, but as I said before, it does not truly matter, for they are both Szarekhan pharaons now, and their dynasties are Szarekhan too. In regards to allies, the Szarekhan dynasty has a host of allies, in part because by aligning with the Szarekhan dynasty, these allies are aligning themselves to the Silent King himself and the new Triarch. From available information, the Nihilak dynasty, arguably the most wealthy of the dynasties, are allied to the Szarekhan dynasty. The Charnovac dynasty has also allied themselves with the Szarekhan dynasty, likely out of need for aid, but also possibly due to the Silent King understanding the threat that the Tyranids pose to the Necron Empire. If their dynasty has not been subsumed into the Szarekhan dynasty, then the Szarekhan dynasty has allies in the Maynarkh dynasty, as well as the Verlect dynasty, and all of the dynasties that the Maynarkh have subjugated. As for specific Necron organizations that are not dynasties, as Silent King of the Necron Empire, Szarekh has at his disposal the Triarch Praetorians, which we went over in previous videos. They are the ultimate enforcers of the rule of the Triarch, as well as the preservers of Necron codes of war and interaction. They are arguably amongst the most powerful Necron units to field on the tabletop, and as Praetorians, they never went into the Great Sleep. Instead, they guided primitive species in the codes of the Necrons and watched over important tomb worlds that they were assigned to. The Silent King also has the service of a collective of death marks called the Breath of Silence, which act as the Silent King's assassins, traveling through pocket dimensions, emerging to assassinate the leaders of the Silent King's enemies, then disappearing. They are described as being the color of jade. Though they officially serve the Silent King, he can never really acknowledge them and their service in a public setting, because if he did, he would admit to breaking Necron codes of war, which specifically forbid the use of death marks against other Necron lords. Zaraq's personal bodyguard are called the Stellar Scythes. They are a group of Lich Guard which are armored in Metagold and Noctilith, and are extremely intelligent and can even philosophize and debate about a variety of topics. They are extremely deadly in close combat, and each of them is given their own flyer. I'd like to think of them as the custodies of the Necrons in relation to their proximity to the Silent King. Last but not least, we have Xerath himself as the architect of biotransference as an ally to the Szarekhan dynasty. He is driven to become a god, and in pursuit of this he wishes to understand the very foundations of life itself. He and Xerath share similar goals, though in different contexts. Xerath is one of the most reviled beings in the Milky Way galaxy, both by Necrons and countless other species, as he was the mind behind biotransference and is the mind behind several horrifying experimentation on living subjects across the galaxy. Xerath himself was always close in position to Szarekh and as the Silent King and to the Triarch, so it would make sense that he would align himself with Szarekh and the Szarekhan dynasty. It is here that I would like to point out that Xerath, though allied with the Szarekhan dynasty, is not Szarekhan. The reason why I point this out is because to promote the Szarekhan dynasty and their paint scheme, GW has changed the scheme of Xerath to be that of the Szarekhan dynasty scheme of bronze. In reality, the traditional scheme of Xerath has always been silver with green necrodermis plates and a baleful orange energy coming from his internal energy, his eye, and his weapon. Of course, anyone can paint their miniatures however they like. I myself have painted my Xerath as an avatar of Xerath accompanying the Ogdebek dynasty. I'm just saying, traditionally, his colors are silver, green, and orange. Most people tend to think that crypteks are independent agents devoid of a dynasty. However, that is not the case. Crypteks do come from specific dynasties, it's just that they are part of a pan-galactic conclave of crypteks, which makes them available for hire to anybody or any dynasty they choose. In the case of Xerath, it was never confirmed what dynasty he was originally a part of, but if we were to go off of his army green necrodermis armor plates and the orange internal energy of his traditional color scheme, it would place him as a member of the Mafrit dynasty. This is, of course, merely speculation, but it also supports the possibility that Hapdatra and Misafet, the two other pharons on the Triarch, would be painted in their original dynastic color schemes, if not for the fact that in doing so, they would break the uniformity of the entire Silent King model and would also reveal what dynasty they really come from. The crypteks of the Szarekhan dynasty are known for their skill at manipulating blackstone, which is a stone-like material that's similar to onyx or obsidian that repels the influence of the warp. Also called Noctilith, this is the material that I was referring to when I was talking about the Stellar Scythes. They are armored in anti-psyker stone, but every Szarekhan unit from the lowly warrior all the way up to the lords of the dynasty have a piece of Noctilith incorporated into their necrodermis, and if I were to guess, I would say that their Ankh is the piece that's made out of Noctilith, because the Ankh is black, which makes the dynasty generally anti-psyker and anti-warp. This was likely really important in the War in Heaven, in which the Necrons fought against the psychic Old Ones and the psychic species of the Old Ones that they created, but it is just as important now with the warp being as tumultuous as it is now, and with the existence of warp entities and Eldar gods. The Szarekhan dynasty has some of the best armor and most destructive weapons of the dynasties, and it is said, according to available lore, that those dynasties who swear loyalty to the Silent King soon find themselves having the same benefits, which technically means that you could use the Szarekhan dynasty rules for the Mithrid dynasty, the Charnavak dynasty, or even the Maynarkh dynasty if you wanted to. And speaking of Blackstone and Noctilith, if you look at where the Szarekhan dynasties are across the Milky Way galaxy, many of them are near contra-empiric nexuses or Blackstone fortresses, which is not a coincidence. The capital or crown world of the Szarekhan dynasty is no world or planet, but instead the city-sized personal worship of the Silent King called the Song of Oblivion. It is aboard the Sword of Oblivion that those Szarekhan dynasty Necrons which the Silent King took with him during the exile resided, and it's from this ship that the Silent King and the Triarch command the forces beneath them. Kind of like a sidebar, notice how his ship is called the Song of Oblivion. What's the formal title of the Maynarkh Pharaoh? Her name is Sunbakir, the Mother of Oblivion. Is that a connection? I don't know. I'm just gonna leave that alone. If I could add one more thing about the Szarekhan dynasty, it would be my suspicion of the Silent King's nature. We all know that he regrets undergoing biotransference and turning the Necrontyr into the Necrons, and there are definitely rumors that he wishes to reverse biotransference somehow, which is why he acknowledges that the Tyranids are the biggest threat to the galaxy and to the dream he has for Necrons, since Tyranids devour organic material, and organic material is what he would need to make the reversal of biotransference a reality. But we also know that harboring a secret resentment to being a Necron leaves one open and susceptible to the Flayer virus. Where other Necron lords fear even being near those who will have the Flayer virus, the Silent King himself interacted with and probably still interacts with beings who have the Flayer virus or Flayer virus infected dynasties fairly frequently. So my question is, how many steps away is the Silent King from becoming a Flayer himself? And if he isn't anywhere near becoming a Flayer, similar to the Maynarkh dynasty, what levels of barbarism and brutality has he manifested in his past to keep the personal infection of the Flayer virus at bay? We may never know, but it can lead to some interesting speculations. So just to do an overview and go over some of the important points I went over in this video, the Szarekhan dynasty has multiple dynastic territories throughout the Milky Way galaxy and may even have territories outside of the Milky Way galaxy. The Szarekhan dynasty has multiple pharons because it is composed of multiple dynasties subsumed into the Szarekhan dynasty. One of the pharons is Szarekh, who also serves as the Silent King of the Necron Empire, joined by two other Szarekhan dynasty pharons on the new Triarch. The Szarekhan dynasty has a number of formidable allies, from the Nihilakh to the Charnavak and the Maynarkh dynasties, as well as the Breath of Silence Deathmark cadre, the Stellar Scythes Lich Guards, all Triarch Praetorians, and even Xeras himself. The Szarekhan dynasty have Noctilith incorporated into their build, and they are physically anti-psyker. They have the best armor and the best weaponry, and their cryptechs are known to be skilled at manipulating Noctilith. And last but not least, Szarekh is a mysterious figure, and he has assured that the Necrons cannot remember much before the War in Heaven regarding both him and his dynasty, the Szarekhan dynasty. And that has been my deep dive of the Szarekhan dynasty. I felt like most people would assume that I would save that for the last because they're the newest and the biggest of dynasty. But the way that I'm going about the dynasties is I'm going from furthest east to west of Terra. So that's the reason why I started with the Charnavak dynasty. They have the furthest dynasty to the east, and then right next to them is the Szarekhan dynasty, or at least one of them. So the Szarekhan dynasty sound very cool. I think there's a perception that the Szarekhan dynasty is the most powerful dynasty, and I guess that's subjective. The only reason that they have so much power in numbers is because their pharaoh is the Silent King, and that enabled them to acquire other dynasties and kind of like grow in size and territory. But they also, the Szarekhan dynasty seems to just be tyrants like most other Necrons. You know, they just take other people's dynasties. It's said in the lore that the Szarekhan nobles view the galaxy with a sense of entitlement, meaning they think everything is theirs. And there hasn't been anything or anyone to stop them from believing that. Though there is a kind of threat when it comes to the Saltec dynasty, which is kind of doing the same thing. I do love the scheme for the Szarekhan dynasty. I just love dark metal schemes. Like I said before, I collect Ogdebek, but like I just like their scheme and how to accomplish it. They sound like a pretty cool dynasty. But I tried my best in this video not to hype them up to any degree. I kind of tried to talk about them as if they were like a regular dynasty, but it's just hard to do that when their pharaoh is the Silent King of the Necron Empire, you know. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments below. But without anything else to be said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.